Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Cyber Threat Intelligence Sharing in Government, sponsored by Anomaly on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Melinda Rogers, the Deputy Chief Information Officer at the Justice Department, Colonel Paul Kraft, the Director of Operations for Joint Force Headquarters, Department of Defense Information Networks, Brian Murphy, the Principal Deputy Undersecretary in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at the Homeland Security Department, Scott Algier, the Executive Director of the Information Technology, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and Trish Cagliostro, Director of Federal Solution Architects for Anomaly. So at the end of the last segment, we started talking a little bit about the volume, and Colonel Kraft, you kind of had an internal laugh, we all saw it. And then we also started talking about sticks and taxing standards. So let me tag back to the volume piece. One of the things about volume is kind of Trish went through all how things have just grown and grown and grown. It's even more massive, as you mentioned at the DoD. Maybe talk about the volume issue and the data issue.
Sure. So again, as we flip the DoD's network really to an extremely large sensor grid, the volume of attacks that we see with the current number of countermeasures that are out there are in the trillions per day. And so we don't lack the data. It's really getting after the analytics and being able to broadly share that is the key to our mutual success. So that's, I'll say part one. Part two is yesterday was Patch Tuesday, so second Tuesday of the month. Congratulations. We know that meant Microsoft and Adobe and a couple other key players. Intel dropped in, hey, here's the next couple dozen patches that you need to put on right now. And we know just from industry standards that Patch Tuesday is preceded the next day by Adversary Scan Wednesday, right? So, and so we know that the adversary is already actively looking, and so our job is to look for any of those now known vulnerabilities for the systems that we have and how fast we're able to patch, and also share what the adversary is focusing on. Because they may not be focused on the entire set of the patches, but we can, through a sharing capability, share what those indicators of compromise are and what we across the whole of government need to focus on. So it really is about volume, but then it's about being able to translate that volume and then into a method by which we can share it very quickly. Brian?
Yeah, so I think it was a great point in terms about the volume and how do we manage that and what do we do, and there's a couple of ends of that. One aspect I'll bring up is how do we prioritize the volume? And so good intelligence, understanding these trend lines, understanding what nation states can do, what their capabilities are, is they tend to be very different, obviously, than criminal actors. How do we prioritize that adversary set with limited resources and tools, even in the shared environment, and look at how far advanced they are in terms of penetrating networks and build our kind of volume threat strategy baseline against that. And so that's an ever-shifting situation. As the more we find out about what the adversaries are up to, that helps us look at that problem in that way. So as we go back to those products I initially referred to, prioritizing our products against the number one threat and kind of working back. I'll go back to what we said a couple times, and it does relate to the volume. This is all about the partnerships here, because the new horizons, they're not new, but I think the world is more shifting to go after our intellectual property from both the traditional criminal actor set as well as from the nation states. And so while the government networks are certainly a target, I think we are looking more and more to being partnered aggressively with the business side of the house, because they share that intellectual property, or they own it, that we all depend on for our lives in the U.S. and for government work and et cetera.
Melinda?
Oh, Jason, I was just going to add, I think we talked about volume, we talked about getting information shared at machine speed. I think the other element to this, it's got a complementary but also a critical element, is really the context of this information. So we're talking about contending with billions and trillions of data points, the bits and bytes. But at the end of the day, you still need that human intelligence behind it to really understand what do all these data points mean. And I think the other part of information sharing is the human collaboration. We talked about being plugged in with the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, the rest of the civilian agencies. How do we actually potentially get a group of the key stakeholders together and talk about these different anomalies or trends that we're seeing? I think there's definitely an element to that, to information sharing, that goes well beyond just the transmittal of the bits and bytes.
And I think Melinda makes a great point, because I think, Trish, you're trying to get down to that path earlier. Trish, jump in.
Yeah, and something I'd like to add to that. So the ultimate goal is to get relevant intelligence. that you are going to take intelligence from a variety of sources, whether it's commercial partners, whether it's ISACs, whether it's us or someone else, the government, and ultimately the goal is that you want relevant intelligence. And the way that you find that relevance to your organization are going to be things like the context around it. For example, if I know that something is associated with a Russian actor who always targets the government, my priority level jumps way up because I'm a government organization, it's likely accurate. If I know something is of a more serious behavior, that's helpful. If I just tell you here's a bad IP address, it's like, okay, well, what kind of bad? Is it a scanning IP address? Is it APT? Is it command and control? All those behaviors ultimately are going to help drive your response and your action for it. So to me, when we think about context behind it, context is one of the most important pieces where, and that's where also a human comes in as well too, is to be able to add that context. I tell my customers all the time, the most valuable thing that you guys can do, we're going to handle the machine aspects. What we want you guys to do is, and where does you spend your time, is ultimately in building those relationships and adding that context, the indicator, because ultimately it's going to empower your analysts, the organizations that you share it with, and ultimately it gives you something that's a lot more actionable.
One of the things that comes up is when we talk about the volume is how do you prioritize what's important, what's not? And maybe Scott, jump in a little bit because you're getting it from both sides, right? You're getting industry telling you, hey, we have this problem. And then your government saying, hey, there's this problem over here too. Talk maybe a little bit about that prioritization piece. And obviously that will lead us down the path also to automation.
Yeah, definitely. So prioritization is really tricky, right? Because what's a priority to one organization may not necessarily be a priority to another organization. They could be using different tools, different technologies. So what we try to help our members with is trending analysis. So within the TIP platform that we use, there's the ability to identify which indicators are being more populated within the platform. What do we see more activity on? How is that associated with specific malware? We're also working on vulnerability exploitation reports. So you can go down rabbit holes and try and track down every indicator, or you could look at what's on your environment and what are the indicators that are exploiting the software or hardware that's in my environment. And so that helps make the indicator hunting a little easier. And then I guess the third element to jump on what Melinda was saying was certainly the human-to-human collaboration, where there's many times where we get some of the top analysts from member companies talking to other top analysts on what they're seeing, what are the trends they're seeing. Hey, even as a matter of, we've seen this IP address, we're not quite sure what it is. We're not seeing it in our own internal platform. Is anyone else seeing it? And yes, we've seen it, and by the way, it's malicious. So getting those humans to talk to each other is really serves as a force multiplier, because we can't look at everything. We can't all track all of the actors that are out there. So by dividing up who's looking at specific threat actors, and instead of having one company try to look at 20 of them, we can have 5 companies look at 4 of them, and then we can do a better job at that.
Trish?
Yeah, and something to add to that, I think, so one of my first jobs, we had created something that we wanted to share with the larger group in the Department of Defense, and we got pushback from leadership, where the reason we didn't want to share it wasn't because of sensitivity or classification. It was because you don't have to beat the bear out of the woods, you have to beat the other campers. And that culturally has been how we've approached cyber threat information sharing for a really long time. We face a 2 million person workforce shortage by 2020. We have to get past that. There's classification, there's all these complications that do come in, but I think Scott had made a great point. One of the reasons why these collaboration programs work is because it essentially acts as a force multiplier of the best and the brightest, where it's allowing you to leverage resources that you wouldn't normally have. And I think that's really important when we think about information sharing, is to keep in mind that the problem is not going to get better even if you have all the money in the world and can hire all the people you want. It's still going to be a problem because there's not that many people to hire. And so the information sharing piece can help that.
The levels of data you can't hire.
Exactly, that's definitely not a people problem.
So, Colonel, one thing about, I think we all made the case for automation pretty well, but it's not that easy. So maybe some of the challenges you guys are starting to see with automation with your $24 billion network sensor thing.
Yes. So the challenge is, and I say this, I kind of eat my own words, but I'll go back to it. I said this about 2 years ago. We're not going to be able to people our way out of this challenge, but it is all about people, right? So it's having the right amount of people and the right talent in order to do this work. That's why we're looking at automated tools. So artificial intelligence is a big push. Department of Defense is looking at the Joint AI Center as a major initiative going forward, because we realize a lot of this is just being able to parse and correlate the massive amounts of data sets we have in order for humans to make better decisions about what we need to do and what we need to focus on. And so, I talked a little about patch Tuesday equals scan Wednesday equals they're going to weaponize by Thursday, the adversary, and how fast we can get after that. And so we quickly scan and look for what's attacking us, and then try to broadly share what the adversary's focused on from a prioritization perspective. That's just a piece, but for us, the automation and the capabilities we have to equal speed in order for us to have the best secured and defended networks, regardless if it's Department of State, Justice, or the Homeland.
In a sense, isn't that where then Stix and Taxi can come in? Because the standards and this we're all going to get on the same path. Now the path can be very wide, but at least we're on the same path. Maybe Melinda, if you can talk a little bit about the promise or the use of Stix and Taxi. How much is the Justice Department already heading down that path?
So most of the security tools that we have in place today have native capabilities to ingest information in an automated fashion or export data along the same veins. But I think this is one where it truly takes the community of interest, where it's a journey. I think I mentioned this to you, Jason, at the offline, but it's a journey, and we're just at the beginning. We do need to come together. We need to have the right individuals come together to start figuring out what those building blocks look like. How do we start defining those data elements so that we can start leveraging the standard and the mechanism to deliver information more effectively? I hope I'm not alone in saying we're not quite there yet, but we need to get there, and it takes all of us to chip in to help us as a federal government get there.
Scott.
So I was just going to add that there is a lot of work in developing Stix Taxi and maturing it as a standard through OASIS, and there's some excellent ongoing work within that community to help build out that standard for automated sharing. Because version 1 is a great start, but there's definitely ways that we can mature it, and there's a lot of technical experts working through OASIS to improve that capability.
Brian, do you see, from your perspective and how you guys are implementing the standards, is it just it's a time thing? We'll just over time as we get more tools and people get used to it, or is there something else that's a bigger challenge to getting better information sharing, whether it's within Stix and Taxi or more broader?
Yeah, I would agree with Melinda with what she led with, is that we're on the pathway for this. We have a long way to go, and that really goes to the conversations and getting at the heart of the matter with business, our colleagues in the rest of the intelligence community, because these are business decisions both for everybody that has finite resources. So as you choose your way you're going to package your data, if it's compliant with Stix, that's probably a business decision at some level. We have to have conversations where we get together like this and explain the consequences, the back end if you don't choose to do something a certain way. So this common language that we all want to drive towards, as I think you also said, Jason, it needs to be wide. And I think we in the federal government have continued to adjust our the way we interpret this language. And the reason I bring that up is the more we have federal and private sector engagements that we in the DHS do, which is not unique, all of our partners do the same, and we come together, we understand better what business needs, how they're thinking about the future, because this common language isn't static. It can't stay with today. It has to be 4 to 5 years out, or it'll be obsolete by the time we finish the code.
Let me turn to Colonel Croft, because and maybe dissect what Brian said for a second. The amount of data you guys are getting, the volume that you're getting, the veracity of it, right?
Absolutely.
How do you deal with, on one hand, I understand that you can't just jump in with both feet because you really don't know what's at the bottom of the lake. Same time, if you just put one toe in, what are you missing as you kind of wade into the water, get used to the, how do you find that balance of speed versus, I guess, surety?
So a big part of this, when you're looking at it from a big data analytic perspective, is making sure you're asking the best questions possible to get the best data mined out in order to make the right decision. And so we look at, first the easiest one is like, hey, if it's a high volume issue, then it's probably this. If it's like a lot of different indicators of compromise, then it's probably a campaign, and therefore it could be something that we have to deal with, and make sure we're sharing that broadly. What may look like initially a couple different, IPs that are attacking us, and then we look at it, in total, it's maybe 100 million IPs. So one looked like an aggressive attack, by a few IPs, and then all of a sudden you look at it and it's like a botnet, with 100 million IPs. So a big challenge, still a challenge. I mean, we're definitely at the front end of getting this right, is making sure that we're doing the best analytics that we can in order to make informed decisions with the very diverse, structured, unstructured data that we have, and then to be able to share that broadly. So I'll say a multi-part challenge that we've got to get after really across the
And
government.
the never-ending story. I know cyber never ends. Trish, let me bring you into the discussion, because one of the things that I think is missing from this discussion is the urgency that I think everybody has, but from your perspective as maybe the vendor on the panel, one of the things that I'm hearing is a little bit of a hesitancy from the panel. Maybe I'll pick on them a little bit to maybe go in a little quicker with the standards, because if you can get to standards, then understanding what data you have, I'm assuming here, becomes easier. And I'm no cyber expert, so you are.
So I'll defend the panel a little bit. One of the other challenges with STIX is there's probably 3 major versions that are currently out there. Different products support different versions. There's another one that's coming very soon, if it's not out already, 2.1. And so each of those are different. So you get into this compatibility problem that's challenging. It's not a simple thing. When you talk about information sharing, it's complicated. There's a lot of policy. Forget about the technical questions. There's even more policy questions that come into play. And what I always tell my customers is that it's very easy to get hung up in these really scary, larger programmatic questions. I always suggest get some quick wins. Start small. Don't try to boil the ocean on your first initiative. Otherwise, you'll never get there. Build some momentum, get some quick wins going, and then I think that's ultimately how we can get a more positive information sharing programs going.
All right, you stole my last question of the panel.
Sorry.
All right, we'll have to think of another one. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the panel discussion, Cyber Threat, Intelligence Sharing in Government, sponsored by Anomaly on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.